The gaslight flickered across her pale face as the auctioneer's gavel fell with a thunderous crack. Sold to the Duke of Ashford, not cattle, not property, but a woman, Miss Arabella Hartwell, once the pride of London society, now standing on a platform in a shadowed hall where desperate men came to purchase what they could not win through courtship. The Duke's cold grey eyes met hers across the crowd, and in that moment she understood her fate was sealed. But what the formidable Duke did not know, what no one in that wretched room could possibly suspect, was that the woman he'd just acquired to bear his heir carried within her a secret that would shake the very foundations of his ancient line. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're hearing this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning Arabella Hartwell's world began to crumble arrived on an unseasonably cold day in early spring of 1817. Frost still clung to the window panes of Hartwell House in Mayfair, transforming the glass into crystalline patterns that caught the weak sunlight. She stood before her vanity, her lady's maid arranging her chestnut hair into an elaborate coiffure befitting her station as the only daughter of the late Baron Hartwell. Her reflection stared back at her, dark eyes framed by long lashes, pale skin that society deemed fashionably porcelain, a slender figure that her stepmother constantly criticized as too thin for proper childbearing. At 22, Arabella was considered nearly past her prime in the marriage market, a fact her stepmother, Lady Margaret Hartwell, reminded her of with increasing frequency. "You must make yourself agreeable to Lord Pemberton this evening." Her stepmother's voice cut through the morning stillness as she swept into the bedchamber without knocking. Lady Margaret was a handsome woman of 40, with sharp features and sharper ambitions. She had married Arabella's father 3 years after his first wife's death, and within 6 months of producing a male heir, Arabella's half-brother Edmund had firmly established herself as the true mistress of Hartwell House. "He has been most attentive these past weeks. Your father's debts will not pay themselves, and Edmund's inheritance is barely sufficient to maintain the estate." Arabella's fingers tightened on the ivory brush in her hand. The debts. Always the debts. Her beloved father had died 2 years prior, leaving behind a legacy of poor investments and outstanding loans that threatened to consume everything. Lady Margaret had made it abundantly clear that Arabella's duty was to marry wealth, to secure the family's position through an advantageous match. Lord Pemberton, a widower of 50 with 3 grown children, and a fortune built on textile manufacturing in Manchester, represented precisely the kind of salvation Lady Margaret envisioned. "I understand, stepmother," Arabella replied, her voice carefully neutral. She had learned long ago that disagreement only prolonged these encounters. "I wonder if you do," Lady Margaret said, moving closer, her silk skirts rustling with each step. "You carry yourself with entirely too much pride for a woman in your circumstances. Lord Pemberton is not a romantic figure from one of those novels you insist on reading. He is a practical man who requires a wife to manage his household and provide companionship in his declining years. You should be grateful for his interest." Grateful. The word tasted bitter in Arabella's mouth. She had once dreamed of a different kind of marriage, one built on mutual respect, perhaps even affection. She had watched her father and mother together before consumption claimed her mother when Arabella was merely 12. She remembered laughter in the drawing room, her father reading poetry aloud, while her mother worked on her embroidery, the gentle touches and warm glances that spoke of genuine partnership. But such dreams were luxuries she could no longer afford. That evening, Arabella descended the stairs in a gown of pale blue silk that Lady Margaret had insisted upon. The drawing-room was already filled with guests for the small dinner party her stepmother had orchestrated. Lord Pemberton stood near the fireplace, his considerable girth straining against his waistcoat, his thinning hair carefully arranged to disguise his baldness. When he saw her, his small eyes lit with an acquisitive gleam that made her skin crawl. "Miss Hartwell," he said, approaching with surprising agility for a man of his size. "You are a vision this evening. That colour brings out the warmth in your complexion." "You are too kind, Lord Pemberton," Arabella replied, offering a practiced curtsy. Throughout dinner, she performed her role with the precision of an actress well rehearsed. She laughed at Lord Pemberton's stories about his factories, expressed appropriate horror at the unrest among his workers, and nodded sympathetically when he complained about the rising cost of raw materials. Across the table, Lady Margaret watched with approval, while Edmund, her 17-year-old half-brother, focused entirely on his food, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding around him. It was not until after dinner, when the gentlemen had retired for port and cigars, that Arabella found a moment of respite in the music room. She sat at the pianoforte, her fingers finding the keys almost of their own accord, playing a melancholy piece by Mozart that seemed to echo the heaviness in her heart. The music room had been her mother's favorite place, and here, surrounded by memories of happier times, Arabella allowed herself to feel the full weight of her circumstances. "You play beautifully, my dear." Lord Pemberton's voice made her start, her hands crashing discordantly on the keys. He had entered without her noticing, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sent alarm racing through her veins. "Lord Pemberton, I did not hear you enter," she said, rising from the bench, instinctively putting distance between them. "Please, do not stop on my account," he said, moving closer. "I find myself quite taken with you, Miss Hartwell. Your stepmother and I have had several discussions about your future." "I see," Arabella managed, her heart pounding. "I am prepared to offer you marriage," he continued, his tone suggesting he was bestowing a great honor. "I will settle your father's debts and provide you with a comfortable establishment. In return, I expect you to manage my household with efficiency and discretion. I am too old for romantic nonsense, but I believe we could have a perfectly satisfactory arrangement." Before she could formulate a response, he had closed the remaining distance between them, his hand reaching for her waist with a presumption that froze her blood. "You are a comely woman, despite your age and circumstances. I believe you will serve admirably." "Lord Pemberton, please," Arabella said, stepping back sharply, but he followed, his breathing growing heavier. "Come now, surely a woman in your position understands the necessity of demonstrating gratitude," he said, his fingers brushing her arm. The door opened suddenly, and Lady Margaret's voice cut through the tension. "Lord Pemberton, the gentlemen are inquiring after you in the drawing-room." He stepped back immediately, adjusting his waistcoat. Of course. We shall continue our conversation another time, Miss Hartwell." With a slight bow he departed, leaving Arabella trembling with a mixture of relief and dread. Lady Margaret remained in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "You will accept his offer when he makes it formal," she said quietly. "The alternative is far worse than you can imagine. Your father left us in desperate straits, Arabella. Lord Pemberton represents our only viable option." "Surely there must be another way," Arabella whispered. "There is not," her stepmother replied with finality. "You will do your duty to this family, or you will find yourself with no family at all. I have been more than patient with your romantic notions, but patience has limits. Lord Pemberton expects an answer within the fortnight. I suggest you prepare yourself to give him the answer he wishes to hear." After Lady Margaret departed, Arabella sank back onto the piano bench, her hands shaking too violently to return to the keys. Through the window, she could see the lights of London twinkling in the distance, each one representing lives being lived with freedoms she would never know. Her cage was golden, yes, but it was a cage nonetheless, and the bars were closing tighter with each passing day. That night, lying in her bed with moonlight streaming through the curtains, Arabella made a desperate decision. She would write to her Aunt Beatrice in Bath, her mother's sister, who had offered sanctuary years ago after her mother's death. Perhaps there was still time to escape the fate Lady Margaret had designed for her. Perhaps, somewhere beyond the confines of Mayfair society, there was still a possibility of choosing her own path. But even as she formulated her plan, a cold certainty settled over her. Lady Margaret would never permit her to leave, not when so much depended on her obedience. The golden cage was locked, and Arabella could not see how she would ever find the key. The formal announcement of Arabella's engagement to Lord Pemberton occurred exactly 1 week later at Lady Crestwood's Spring Ball, one of the season's most anticipated events. The ballroom at Crestwood House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers. Ladies in their finest silks and gentlemen in immaculate evening dress filled the space with colour and movement, the string orchestra providing a backdrop of refined melody to the buzz of conversation and the swish of dancing couples. Arabella stood beside Lady Margaret, wearing a gown of ivory satin trimmed with seed pearls that her stepmother had commissioned for the occasion. It was beautiful, she acknowledged distantly, and far more expensive than their circumstances should have allowed. But Lady Margaret had been quite clear. Appearances must be maintained, especially tonight. "Smile," Lady Margaret hissed under her breath. "You look as though you are attending a funeral rather than celebrating your betrothal." Arabella forced her lips into a semblance of pleasure as Lord Pemberton approached, his considerable bulk draped in an evening coat of burgundy velvet that did nothing to flatter his figure. In his hand, he carried a small velvet box that contained, she knew, the Pemberton betrothal ring, a large ruby surrounded by diamonds that had adorned the fingers of 3 previous Lady Pembertons. "Miss Hartwell," he said loudly, drawing the attention of nearby guests, "would you do me the great honor of accompanying me to the terrace? I have something of importance to discuss with you." It was theatre, pure and simple. The proposal had already been arranged, negotiated between Lord Pemberton and Lady Margaret, with the cold precision of a business transaction. This public display was merely the official performance for society's benefit. Arabella placed her gloved hand on his proffered arm and allowed him to lead her through the French doors onto the torch-lit terrace, acutely aware of the curious eyes following their progress. The night air was cool against her bare shoulders. Other couples strolled the terrace and descended into the gardens beyond, but Lord Pemberton guided her to a prominent position near the balustrade where they would be clearly visible to those still inside. Beyond the terrace, London spread out in a tapestry of lights and shadows, beautiful and indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding within its boundaries. "Miss Hartwell, Arabella," Lord Pemberton began, producing the velvet box with a flourish. "These past weeks have confirmed what I suspected from our first meeting. You possess all the qualities I seek in a wife: beauty, grace, and a properly submissive temperament. I offer you my name, my protection, and my fortune. Will you consent to become Lady Pemberton?" The words she was supposed to say lodged in her throat. She stared at the ruby ring, seeing not a symbol of love, but the price of her family's salvation. In the ballroom behind them, she could see Lady Margaret watching intently, her expression a clear command. Around them, other guests had begun to gather, sensing the drama about to unfold, anticipating the joyful acceptance that society expected. Arabella began, and then faltered. In that moment of hesitation, everything changed. A commotion near the ballroom entrance drew everyone's attention. A tall woman in an emerald gown swept through the French doors, her face flushed with anger and purpose. Arabella recognized her vaguely, Lady Penelope Ashworth, a widow who had once been prominent in society before some scandal had tarnished her reputation. "How dare you?" Lady Penelope said, her voice carrying clearly across the terrace. She was not addressing Arabella, but Lord Pemberton, who had gone pale as parchment. "Lady Penelope, this is hardly the time or place," he sputtered, attempting to maintain his composure. "Is it not?" Lady Penelope laughed bitterly. "You stand here offering marriage to this innocent girl while your promises to me still echo in my ears. Or have you forgotten the vows you made not 3 months ago in Brighton?" A collective gasp swept through the assembled guests. Arabella felt the terrace tilting beneath her feet as she processed the woman's words. "You are overwrought," Lord Pemberton said, his voice hardening. "You imagine connections where none exist. Do I imagine these?" Lady Penelope pulled a bundle of letters from her reticule, waving them like a weapon. "Your own hand, promising marriage, declaring your devotion? Or perhaps I imagine the child you left me carrying when you departed Brighton so suddenly." The scandal erupted like a bomb. Gasps turned to shocked whispers, whispers to open conversation. Lord Pemberton's face had gone from pale to florid, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "You are a liar and a hysteric," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Lady Crestwood herself emerged onto the terrace, her face a mask of horror. "Lady Penelope, I must ask you to leave at once. Such accusations are true," Lady Penelope interrupted. "Every word. And this innocent girl deserves to know the character of the man she is about to accept." Her eyes, bright with tears and fury, turned to Arabella. "Run, my dear. Run as far from this man as your feet will carry you. He will ruin you, as he has ruined me." The moment hung suspended in time. Arabella stood frozen, the ruby ring still extended toward her in Lord Pemberton's hand, her carefully constructed future crumbling like ash in the wind. She looked at her stepmother, who stood rigid in the doorway, calculation replacing shock in her eyes. She looked at Lord Pemberton, seeing clearly now the selfishness and cruelty that his wealth and position had allowed her to overlook. She looked at the assembled guests, their faces alight with the malicious pleasure that scandal always brought to those not directly touched by it. "I cannot," Arabella heard herself say. "I cannot accept your proposal, Lord Pemberton." His face transformed into something ugly. "You cannot refuse me," he hissed, grabbing her wrist with bruising force. "Your family needs this match. You need this match. Without me, you are nothing. Release her at once." A new voice, cold and commanding, cut through the chaos. Every head turned toward the ballroom entrance where a man stood silhouetted against the candlelight. He stepped forward, and Arabella recognized him with a shock of recognition, the Duke of Ashford, one of England's premier peers, a man whose presence at any social gathering was considered a coup. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, a lean aristocratic face, and eyes of the coldest grey she had ever seen. Lord Pemberton released Arabella's wrist as though burned. "Your Grace, this is a private matter." "It ceased being private when you chose to conduct it before 300 witnesses," the Duke replied, his tone arctic. "The lady has declined your offer. A gentleman would accept her decision with grace." "The lady is in no position to make decisions," Lord Pemberton snapped, his composure entirely shattered. "She is a fortune hunter who has led me to believe—" "Choose your next words with extreme care," the Duke interrupted, and something in his voice made Lord Pemberton step backward. "I will not stand by while you impugn a lady's character to salvage your own wounded pride." Lady Crestwood, sensing an opportunity to redirect the scandal, quickly intervened. "Your Grace is quite right. This evening has been most distressing. Perhaps it would be best if Lord Pemberton and Lady Penelope both took their leave." Within minutes, the terrace had cleared of all but a few lingering onlookers. Arabella found herself standing alone near the balustrade, shaking so violently she had to grip the stone to remain upright. The Duke of Ashford approached slowly, as one might approach a frightened animal. "Miss Hartwell, I believe," he said quietly. "Yes, Your Grace," she managed. "You showed courage tonight," he said. "That cannot have been easy." "I showed nothing but foolishness," Arabella replied, the full weight of her actions suddenly crushing down upon her. "I have destroyed my family's last hope and my own reputation in one thoughtless moment." "Better an honest destruction than a false preservation," he said cryptically. He studied her for a long moment, those grey eyes seeming to see past her carefully maintained composure to the terror beneath. "You will find, Miss Hartwell, that society has a short memory for those it wishes to forgive, and an even shorter memory for those under the protection of power." Before she could ask what he meant, Lady Margaret appeared, her face a mask of fury barely contained by social propriety. "Arabella, we are leaving, at once." The carriage ride back to Hartwell House was conducted in terrible silence. Lady Margaret stared out the window, her hands clenched in her lap, while Edmund sat hunched in the corner, clearly wishing he could disappear entirely. Only when they were inside the house, the door firmly closed against the London night, did Lady Margaret speak. "You stupid, selfish girl," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Do you comprehend what you have done? Lord Pemberton was our only option. Without him, the creditors will descend like wolves. The house will be sold. Edmund's education will end. And you will be cast out without a penny or a reference. No respectable family will employ you, and no man of any standing will marry you. You have destroyed us all with your ridiculous pride." "I could not marry him," Arabella whispered. "Not after what? After a spurned mistress created a scene. Did you imagine you would have a faithful husband? That marriage is about love and devotion. You are a fool. Marriage for women like us is about survival. And you have just ensured we will not survive." The words landed like blows, each one driving home the magnitude of her decision. Arabella fled to her chamber, where she collapsed on her bed, finally allowing the tears to come. She had saved herself from Lord Pemberton's touch, yes, but at what cost? Her family's ruin, her own destitution. The prospect of the workhouse or worse loomed before her like a dark spectre. She did not know, could not have known in that moment of despair, that her fate had already been decided by forces beyond her control. The Duke of Ashford had left Lady Crestwood's ball shortly after the scandal, but not before making certain inquiries about Miss Arabella Hartwell's circumstances. And in the cold, calculating manner that had made him one of England's most powerful peers, he had seen an opportunity that would benefit them both, though perhaps not in any way that romance or kindness would recognize. 3 days after the disastrous ball, the creditors arrived. They came in a steady stream, presenting papers to Lady Margaret with the cold efficiency of men accustomed to collecting debts from desperate families. The reality that had been held at bay by promises and negotiations came crashing down with final, irrevocable force. Hartwell House would be sold within the month. Edmund would be withdrawn from Eton, and Arabella, whose disgrace at Lady Crestwood's ball had spread through London society with wildfire speed, found herself facing a future more terrifying than she had imagined possible. "You will go to your Aunt Cecily in Yorkshire," Lady Margaret announced on the 4th morning, her voice flat with defeat. "She has agreed to take you as an unpaid companion. It is more than you deserve, but it will provide you with a roof over your head." Aunt Cecily was her father's elder sister, a sour woman who had never approved of his marriage to Arabella's mother, and who had made her disapproval abundantly clear on the few occasions they had met. The prospect of living under her censure, of spending her days fetching shawls and reading aloud from improving texts, filled Arabella with a quiet despair that was somehow worse than the acute terror of the previous days. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. That afternoon, a footman brought a letter to the drawing-room on a silver salver. Lady Margaret snatched it up, her eyes widening as she recognized the ducal seal. With trembling fingers, she broke the wax and read the contents, her face transforming from shock to calculation to something resembling triumph. "You will not be going to Yorkshire after all," she said slowly, looking at Arabella with an expression that mingled awe and suspicion. "It seems you have attracted a patron of considerable influence." The Duke of Ashford's letter was brief and businesslike. He had, he wrote, taken an interest in Miss Hartwell's unfortunate circumstances. He was aware that her family faced financial difficulties that would result in the dispersal of the household. He was prepared to offer a solution that would benefit all parties. Would Lady Margaret and Miss Hartwell do him the honour of calling upon him at Ashford House in Grosvenor Square the following afternoon? Arabella's hands shook as she read the letter herself. "What can he possibly want?" she whispered. "Whatever it is, we shall give it to him," Lady Margaret replied firmly. "Do not mistake this for rescue, Arabella. Men of the Duke's standing do not involve themselves in the affairs of impoverished gentlewomen out of charity. He wants something, and given our circumstances, we are in no position to refuse." The following afternoon, Arabella found herself dressed in her most respectable day gown. A modest creation of grey wool that Lady Margaret insisted struck the proper note of dignified poverty, being driven through the streets of London to Grosvenor Square. Ashford House was a massive Georgian edifice that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth and power. The butler who greeted them at the door was more perfectly dressed than most gentlemen, and he led them through halls hung with portraits of ducal ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to judge Arabella's presumption in entering their domain. They were shown into a library that was magnificent in its severity. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes, arranged with perfect precision. The 4th wall consisted of tall windows overlooking a private garden where early spring flowers struggled toward bloom. The Duke of Ashford stood before one of these windows, his hands clasped behind his back, his figure silhouetted against the grey London light. "Lady Margaret, Miss Hartwell, thank you for coming," he said, turning to face them. In the clear light of afternoon, Arabella could see him more distinctly than she had at Lady Crestwood's ball. He was handsome in a stern, unapproachable way, his features carved with aristocratic precision, his bearing radiating authority and control. There was no warmth in his grey eyes, only an intelligence that seemed to calculate and weigh everything it observed. "Your Grace does us great honour," Lady Margaret replied, her curtsy deep and deferential. "We are eager to understand how we might be of service. Please sit." He gestured to chairs arranged before an enormous mahogany desk. Once they were seated, he remained standing, a subtle assertion of dominance that was not lost on Arabella. "I will be direct, as I find discretion wastes time that none of us possess. Miss Hartwell, I am in need of a wife. You are in need of rescue from circumstances that will otherwise see you reduced to poverty. I propose we assist one another." The silence that followed was absolute. Arabella felt as though all the air had been sucked from the room. She stared at the Duke, unable to process what she had just heard. "Your Grace cannot be serious," she finally managed. "I am entirely serious," he replied. "I require an heir to secure the dukedom. I am not a man inclined toward the theatre of courtship, nor do I have time for the lengthy negotiations that typically precede aristocratic marriages. You are gently born, educated, and by all accounts possessed of a sound mind. Most importantly, you are in desperate need of protection. These factors combine to make you suitable for my purposes." "This is most unexpected," Lady Margaret said, and for once Arabella could hear genuine shock in her stepmother's voice. "Your Grace must understand. Arabella has no dowry. Her father's debts have consumed—" "I am aware of the financial situation," the Duke interrupted. "I am not seeking a dowry. Indeed, I am prepared to settle those debts as part of our arrangement. Hartwell House will be saved. Your son's education will continue. Miss Hartwell will become the Duchess of Ashford. In return, she will fulfill the basic duties of a duchess, provide an heir, maintain my household, and uphold the dignity of the title. Nothing more is required. Nothing more." Arabella found her voice, and with it, her courage. "You speak of marriage as though it were a business contract." "It is a business contract," the Duke replied coolly. "Aristocratic marriages have always been thus. The only difference is that I am honest about the terms. I am not offering you romance or companionship, Miss Hartwell. I am offering you security, position, and the opportunity to escape the fate that otherwise awaits you. You will have your own apartments, your own income, and the freedom to pursue your own interests, provided you are discreet and fulfill your obligation to produce an heir. Many women would consider this a favorable arrangement." "Many women might," Arabella said, feeling a spark of the spirit that had led her to refuse Lord Pemberton. "But you are asking me to sell myself like chattel." "I am offering to buy you out of poverty," he corrected. "There is a difference. Lord Pemberton would have purchased you to satisfy his appetites. I am offering you a transaction where both parties benefit equally." "How can we benefit equally when you hold all the power?" Arabella demanded. For the first time, something flickered in those cold grey eyes. Not warmth, but perhaps respect. "A fair question," he acknowledged. "Allow me to be clearer about the terms. You will become Duchess of Ashford with all the rights and privileges pertaining thereto. You will have complete control of the household, an independent income of £5,000 per annum for your personal use, and the freedom to travel, pursue charitable works, or engage in society as you see fit. Once you have provided an heir, your duty to me will be fulfilled. I will not trouble you further." "And if I refuse?" Arabella asked. "Then I will wish you well in Yorkshire," he replied. "This is not coercion, Miss Hartwell. It is an offer, made in good faith, that you are free to decline. However, I would ask that you consider it carefully before rejecting it out of pride. Pride is a luxury that poverty cannot afford." The truth of his words cut deeper than any insult could have. Arabella looked at Lady Margaret, whose face had regained its calculating expression. She could see her stepmother already tallying the benefits, already accepting on her behalf. "May I have time to consider?" Arabella asked. "You may have until tomorrow evening," the Duke replied. "I leave for my estate in Wiltshire the following morning. If you accept, we will be married by special license before I depart. If you decline, I will instruct my solicitors to provide you with a sum of £200 as compensation for your time and trouble today. It will not save your family, but it will ease your transition to Yorkshire." He pulled a cord, and the butler appeared as though conjured. "Mrs. Hensworth will show you to a parlour where refreshments have been prepared. Take whatever time you need to discuss the matter privately." They were ushered from the library into a smaller but no less elegant parlour. The moment the door closed, Lady Margaret turned to Arabella with fierce intensity. "You will accept," she said. "How can I agree to such a cold arrangement?" Arabella protested. "How can you refuse it?" Lady Margaret countered. "He is a duke, Arabella, a duke. Do you comprehend what that means? You will be one of the highest-ranking women in England. You will have wealth, position, and power beyond anything you could have dreamed. And he is honest about his expectations, which is more than most men offer. He will not abuse you or restrict you once you fulfill your duty. Many wives in love matches cannot say the same." "But there will be no love," Arabella said softly. "There will be security," Lady Margaret replied. "There will be respect. There will be purpose. Love is a fairy tale for young girls. This is reality, and reality offers you a choice between dignity and destitution. Choose wisely." Arabella moved to the window, looking out at the garden where a solitary robin hopped among the emerging crocuses. She thought of Aunt Cecily's cheerless house in Yorkshire. She thought of Lady Penelope's desperate face at the ball, a warning of what became of women without protection in a world designed by and for men. She thought of her mother, who had loved her father truly, but who had also been protected by his title and fortune. What would her mother counsel in this moment? "He wants an heir," she said aloud, thinking through the implications. "That means intimate relations." "Of course," Lady Margaret said bluntly. "Did you imagine children arrived by prayer? It is a duty all wives must perform. At least the Duke is young and not unpleasant to look upon. You could fare much worse." Arabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of inevitability settling over her like a shroud. There was no real choice here, no path that led to freedom or autonomy. There was only survival in whatever form it presented itself. And perhaps, she thought with a strange calm, there was a kind of power in knowing exactly what was expected, in entering a contract with clear terms, rather than stumbling blind into a marriage built on false promises. When they returned to the library, the Duke was seated at his desk, reviewing papers with the focused attention of a man accustomed to managing vast enterprises. He looked up as they entered, his expression neutral. "Miss Hartwell," he said simply. She met his cold grey eyes and saw neither cruelty nor kindness, only the same pragmatic assessment she had witnessed before. "I accept your proposal, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart, "upon the condition that you honour all the terms you have stated. "You have my word as a gentleman," he replied, rising and extending his hand. "We have an accord." His hand was cool and firm as it clasped hers, sealing a bargain that would change her life forever. As their fingers touched, Arabella felt a strange sensation, as though she stood at the edge of a precipice, looking down into an unknown darkness. But she did not pull away. She had made her choice, or perhaps the choice had made her. Either way, there was no turning back now. "The ceremony will take place the day after tomorrow at 11 o'clock in the private chapel at Ashford House," the Duke said, releasing her hand and returning to his businesslike tone. "I will have my solicitors draw up the marriage settlement tonight. You may review it tomorrow morning before the wedding. If you find any terms unsatisfactory, we will amend them. I expect this arrangement to be equitable, Miss Hartwell, whatever else it may be." As they left Ashford House and returned to the carriage, Arabella felt numb, as though she were floating outside her own body, watching from a distance as her fate unfolded. In 2 days, she would be a duchess. In 2 days, she would belong to a man who saw her as a means to an end. In 2 days, her old life would be irrevocably over. The secret she carried, the one thing she had not told the Duke, had not told anyone, pressed against her heart like a stone. But that was a revelation for another day. For now, she had agreed to the bargain. The rest would unfold as fate decreed. The private chapel at Ashford House was a jewel of medieval architecture, its vaulted ceiling soaring upward toward stained glass windows that depicted scenes from the lives of saints. Early morning light filtered through the colored glass, painting the ancient stone in shades of sapphire and ruby. It was beautiful, Arabella acknowledged distantly, and utterly impersonal. The perfect setting for the transaction that was about to occur. She stood in a small vestibule adjacent to the chapel, wearing a gown of ivory silk that the Duke's seamstresses had created with astounding speed. It was elegant and perfectly fitted, the sort of gown she had once dreamed of wearing on her wedding day, but there were no flowers in her hair, no bridesmaids giggling with excitement, no proud father waiting to escort her down the aisle. There was only Mrs. Hensworth, the Duke's housekeeper, arranging the folds of her train with efficient kindness. "You look very beautiful, Your Grace. That is Miss Hartwell, soon to be Your Grace," the older woman said, catching herself with a small smile. "His Grace is already in the chapel with the bishop. We can proceed when you are ready." "I am ready," Arabella lied. The walk down the chapel aisle was brief. Lady Margaret and Edmund sat in one pew, the Duke's solicitor and personal secretary in another. The Duke of Ashford waited before the altar in a dark blue coat, his expression as impassive as carved marble. The bishop, an elderly man with kind eyes, smiled encouragingly as Arabella took her place beside her intended husband. The ceremony was efficient. The words of the service washed over her like distant waves, familiar yet somehow alien. When the bishop asked if she took this man to be her lawfully wedded husband, her "I do" emerged steady and clear. When the Duke spoke his own vows, his voice was firm, betraying nothing of his inner thoughts. The ring he slipped onto her finger was a heavy gold band set with diamonds. The Ashford Duchess ring, she understood, worn by generations of women who had stood where she now stood. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the bishop intoned. "Your Grace, you may kiss your bride." The Duke turned to her, and for a moment their eyes met. In that brief connection, Arabella searched for something: warmth, anticipation, even nervousness, but found only that same cool assessment. His lips brushed hers, light as a whisper, a social formality devoid of passion or promise. Then he stepped back, and it was done. She was the Duchess of Ashford, bound by law and church to a man who remained a complete stranger. The breakfast that followed was slightly less austere. They gathered in a dining room where the table had been set with silver and crystal, and footmen served courses of remarkable quality. Lady Margaret glowed with barely suppressed triumph, already envisioning her elevated status as stepmother to a duchess. Edmund, uncomfortable in his formal clothes, ate with focused determination. The Duke's secretary, Mr. Thornfield, made polite conversation about the journey to Wiltshire, while the solicitor, Mr. Graves, assured Arabella that all documents had been properly executed. The deed to Hartwell House has been transferred to your brother's name, with the Duke's guarantee of all outstanding debts, Mr. Graves explained to Lady Margaret. The property is secure. Additionally, arrangements have been made for your son's continued education. His Grace is most generous, Lady Margaret said, and for once Arabella heard genuine gratitude in her stepmother's voice. The Duke acknowledged the thanks with a brief nod, but said nothing. He ate sparingly, spoke little, and seemed eager for the formalities to conclude. Finally, after the last course had been cleared, he rose. "The carriage departs in 1 hour," he said to Arabella. "Mrs. Hensworth will assist you with final preparations. I have business to conclude with Mr. Thornfield before we leave." "Yes, Your Grace," Arabella replied, then caught herself. Yes, husband." The word felt foreign on her tongue. "Ashford will suffice when we are alone," he said. "Your Grace in company. We need not pretend to an intimacy we do not possess." With that remarkably cold pronouncement, he departed, leaving Arabella to wonder if her marriage would always be conducted in such Arctic tones. The journey to Ashford Abbey in Wiltshire took most of the day. The Duke's travelling coach was luxuriously appointed, but the atmosphere within was strained. They sat across from one another, the Duke reading papers, while Arabella watched the countryside roll past the window. Occasionally, he would point out a landmark or offer some brief comment about the estate they were approaching, but mostly they travelled in silence. It was not until late afternoon, with the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon, that the coachman called out, "Ashford Abbey ahead, Your Grace." Arabella leaned forward, catching her first glimpse of her new home. Ashford Abbey sprawled across a gentle rise, a magnificent Elizabethan manor built on the foundations of a medieval monastery. Its golden Cotswold stone glowed in the slanting light, and its mullioned windows reflected the sky like dozens of watchful eyes. Gardens stretched in formal patterns around the main house, while beyond she could see parkland dotted with ancient oaks and, in the distance, the silver glint of a lake. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "It is home," the Duke replied, and for the first time she heard something other than coldness in his voice, a note of pride, perhaps even affection. "The estate has been in my family since 1580. The responsibility for its preservation now rests with both of us." The household staff assembled to greet them in the great hall, housekeeper, butler, footman, maids, all standing in perfect formation. Mrs. Barlow, the housekeeper, was a formidable woman of 60, with sharp eyes that assessed Arabella in a single sweeping glance. Mr. Jeffreys, the butler, was even older, his bearing suggesting he had served the Dukes of Ashford for decades. "Welcome home, Your Grace," Mrs. Barlow said, curtsying to Arabella. "We are honoured to serve you." "Thank you, Mrs. Barlow," Arabella replied, drawing on every lesson in deportment her mother had taught her. "I look forward to learning the workings of the household from you." Something flickered in the housekeeper's eyes. Approval, perhaps, and Arabella felt a small measure of relief. If she was to live here, potentially for the rest of her life, she would need allies among the staff. The Duke led her on a brief tour of the main rooms, the drawing room, the library, the dining room, each more magnificent than the last. Finally, they ascended a grand staircase to the private family apartments on the second floor. He stopped before an ornate door and pushed it open, revealing a suite of rooms decorated in shades of cream and gold. "Your apartments," he said. "They have been refreshed for your arrival. If you wish to make changes, you have only to inform Mrs. Barlow." He gestured to another door across the corridor. "My rooms are there. There is a connecting door, but it remains locked unless—" He paused, seeming to search for delicate phrasing. "Unless circumstances require it to be otherwise." Arabella felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I understand. Tonight, You should rest from the journey, he continued, his voice returning to its businesslike tone. Tomorrow, Mrs. Barlow will introduce you to the household operations. In 3 days' time, we will host a dinner for the local gentry to introduce you as the new Duchess. Any questions you have, direct them to Mrs. Barlow or Mr. Thornfield. They will assist you in learning your duties. And you? Arabella asked. Will you assist me? He looked at her for a long moment, those grey eyes unreadable. I am not skilled in instruction, Your Grace. I find it more efficient to allow people to learn through observation and practice. You are intelligent. You will adapt quickly. It was both compliment and dismissal. He bowed slightly, a gesture of respect rather than affection, and departed, leaving Arabella alone in her gilded cage. For it was a cage, she realized, however beautiful. The bars were made of silk and silver, but they were bars nonetheless. A lady's maid appeared, a young woman named Sarah, who helped her out of her travelling dress and into a simpler gown for dinner. As Sarah worked, chattering about the household and the estate, Arabella found herself studying her reflection in the mirror. She looked the same as she had that morning, yet everything had changed. She was a duchess now, mistress of one of England's great houses, married to one of the realm's premier peers. She should feel triumphant, secure, rescued. Instead, she felt profoundly alone. Dinner was served in a small family dining room rather than the grand formal space. The Duke had changed into evening clothes and seemed slightly less forbidding in the candlelight. They ate in relative silence until dessert was served, and then he spoke. I should explain the expectations regarding marital duties, he said, his tone as formal as if he were discussing agricultural production. That is not necessary, Arabella said quickly, mortified. It is necessary, he corrected. We are both adults entering into an arrangement with clearly defined goals. One of those goals requires physical intimacy. I do not wish to distress you, but neither will I tiptoe around the reality of the situation. Arabella set down her spoon, her appetite vanishing. Then speak plainly, if you must. I will give you time to adjust to your new circumstances, he said. A week, perhaps 2. But we are neither of us getting younger, and the duty of producing an heir cannot be delayed indefinitely. When the time comes, I will expect you to receive me. I will be as considerate as possible, but I will not pretend the act is something other than what it is, a biological necessity for the continuation of the line. The clinical coldness of his words struck her like a physical blow. You speak of creating a child as though you were breeding horses, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. I speak of it honestly, he replied. Is that not preferable to false declarations of passion? I will not lie to you, Arabella. I will not whisper sweet deceits while I use your body for my purposes. I will be honest, and I will expect honesty in return. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I find I am more fatigued than I realized. If you will excuse me, I shall retire. Of course, he said, rising as well with perfect manners. Good evening, Your Grace. Arabella fled to her chambers, where Sarah waited to help her prepare for bed. Once she was alone, dressed in a fine linen nightgown that felt strange against her skin, she stood at the window, looking out over the darkened park. Somewhere in those grounds, peacocks called with their eerie, human-like cries. Above, stars emerged in a sky unmarred by London's smoke. She thought of the secret she carried, the truth she had not shared with the Duke. The physician who had examined her after a severe illness last year had been clear. There was damage, scarring from the fever that had nearly claimed her life. Conception would be difficult, perhaps impossible. She should have told the Duke before the marriage. His entire arrangement depended on her ability to provide an heir. But she had been desperate, and fear had silenced her. What would he do when he discovered the truth? Would he set her aside, seek an annulment? Would she be cast out after all, her brief tenure as Duchess ending in disgrace? The questions circled in her mind like carrion birds, offering no answers, only increasing dread. A soft knock at the connecting door made her heart leap into her throat. She stood frozen, waiting, but after a moment she heard footsteps retreating. He had come to the door, then thought better of it. Relief and something she could not quite name, disappointment perhaps, washed over her in equal measure. She climbed into the enormous four-poster bed, pulled the covers up to her chin, and stared at the canopy above her head. This was her life now, this cold, honest arrangement with a man who saw her as a means to an end. She had traded one cage for another, though this one came with a duchess's coronet. As sleep finally claimed her, her last conscious thought was a prayer, not for happiness, for that seemed impossibly distant, but for the courage to survive whatever came next. The days that followed established a pattern that would define Arabella's new existence. She rose early, breakfasted alone in her sitting room, and spent her mornings with Mrs. Barlow, learning the intricate operations of the great house. The abbey was vast, requiring a staff of over 60 servants to maintain, and its domestic machinery ran with clockwork precision. Arabella proved an apt pupil, her natural intelligence and her mother's training serving her well. Within a week she understood the household accounts, the seasonal rituals of country estate life, and the subtle hierarchies among the staff. The Duke of Ashford, as she had learned to think of him, was a distant presence. He breakfasted earlier than she did, spent his days managing the estate with Mr. Thornfield, and often dined out with neighbours, or in his study with paperwork. When they did meet, usually at dinner or in passing through the house, he was unfailingly polite, asking after her comfort and whether she required anything. But there was no warmth, no curiosity about her as a person. She was the Duchess, fulfilling her role with acceptable competence. That seemed to satisfy him entirely. The dinner party, to introduce her to local society, arrived with nerve-wracking speed. Mrs. Barlow and the staff transformed the formal dining room into a showcase of ducal grandeur. The table gleamed with silver and crystal, the floral arrangements were spectacular, and the menu that the cook had prepared would have graced any London table. Arabella dressed with particular care, wearing a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the colour of her eyes, with the Ashford sapphires glittering at her throat and wrists. When she descended the stairs to where Ashford waited in the hall, she saw his eyes widen fractionally, the first genuine reaction she had witnessed from him in the 10 days of their marriage. "You look well," he said, which she supposed was high praise from a man so sparing with compliments. "Thank you," she replied, touching the sapphires at her throat. "These are extraordinary." "They suit you," he said. Then, surprisingly, he added, "My mother wore them. She would have approved of your choice." It was the first time he had mentioned his mother, who had died when he was 15. Arabella wanted to ask more, to probe this small crack in his formidable armour, but the first guests were already arriving, and the moment passed. The evening tested every social skill Arabella possessed. The local gentry were curious about the new Duchess, and she could sense their assessment behind every polite smile. Lord and Lady Fairfax, whose estate bordered Ashford land, were gracious but watchful. The vicar, Mr. Pemberton, no relation to the odious Lord Pemberton, was kind and spoke warmly of the Duke's support for the parish. Sir Geoffrey and Lady Sutton, an older couple who clearly remembered Ashford's mother, studied Arabella with shrewd eyes. But it was the arrival of Mr. Julian Gray that caused the first real disruption to the carefully orchestrated evening. Mr. Gray was, she learned quickly, something of an anomaly in the neighbourhood. A gentleman of independent means who had chosen to settle in Wiltshire after years spent travelling abroad. He was perhaps 30, with chestnut hair that refused to stay properly arranged, intelligent hazel eyes, and an easy, irreverent manner that seemed almost calculated to contrast with Ashford's formality. "Your Grace," he said, bowing over her hand with theatrical flourish, "how delightful to discover that Ashford has finally acquired a duchess. We had begun to suspect he might remain forever married, only to his account books and crop rotations." "Mr. Gray exaggerates, as always," Ashford said dryly, though Arabella detected no real annoyance in his tone. He finds my dedication to proper estate management boring, as he finds most practical matters boring. Guilty as charged, Mr. Gray said cheerfully. I much prefer interesting people to interesting ledgers. Tell me, Your Grace, how are you finding Wiltshire after London? Do you miss the excitement of the city? I have been here such a short time that I can hardly form an opinion, Arabella replied carefully, but the countryside is very beautiful. Diplomatically answered, Mr. Gray said, his eyes twinkling. I can see you are already adapting to the careful neutrality required in country society. But I do hope, once you have settled, you might allow me to show you some of the more intriguing aspects of the neighborhood. There is a Roman villa being excavated on my property, and I suspect you might find it more engaging than the usual round of morning calls and card parties. Your Grace has quite enough to occupy her time without your hair-brained antiquarian pursuits, Ashford interjected, but again there was no real censure in his tone. Arabella sensed a friendship between these two men, despite their vastly different temperaments. The dinner proceeded with appropriate formality. Arabella found herself seated between the vicar and Sir Geoffrey, both of whom proved pleasant dinner companions. She was conscious of being observed, evaluated, judged against some standard she could not quite discern. But by the time dessert was served, she sensed a general relaxation among the guests. She had passed their test, or at least not failed it spectacularly. It was during the ladies' withdrawal to the drawing-room that Lady Sutton cornered her beside the tea service. The older woman's sharp eyes studied her with an intensity that made Arabella want to fidget. "You are not what I expected," Lady Sutton said bluntly. "I am sorry to disappoint," Arabella replied carefully. "I did not say you disappointed," Lady Sutton corrected. "I said you were unexpected. We heard rumours, of course, about the sudden marriage, the lack of courtship. There was speculation that Ashford had been forced into an unwise alliance." She paused, sipping her tea. "But I see no foolishness in you. You conducted yourself tonight with grace and intelligence. Whatever the circumstances of your marriage, you appear to be taking your duties seriously." "I am trying," Arabella said honestly. "That is all any of us can do," Lady Sutton replied, her expression softening slightly. "The position of Duchess is not an easy one, particularly when one enters it without preparation. If you find yourself in need of guidance that the servants cannot provide, you may call upon me. I was a great friend to Ashford's mother. I would not see her son's wife struggle unnecessarily." The unexpected kindness brought tears pricking at Arabella's eyes. "Thank you, Lady Sutton. That is most generous." When the gentleman rejoined them, Mr. Gray immediately sought out Arabella, much to Ashford's visible irritation. "I was entirely serious about the Roman villa," he said, "and I suspect you might benefit from friendly company that does not view you primarily as a vessel for ducal heirs." "Mr. Gray," Arabella said, shocked despite herself. "Too blunt." He grinned. "I apologize. It is my besetting sin. But truly, Your Grace, if you find yourself at loose ends, I should be delighted to provide distraction. I have quite the most interesting library in the county, Ashford's being too full of worthy agricultural treatises to count, and I can promise conversations about topics other than crop yields and drainage improvements." Before she could respond, Ashford appeared at her elbow. "Gray, stop monopolizing my wife. Lady Fairfax wishes to discuss the flower show with Her Grace." As Ashford guided her firmly away, his hand at her elbow, Arabella felt an unexpected flutter of something. Jealousy, perhaps. Surely not from a man who had made it abundantly clear that their marriage was purely practical. The guests departed near midnight, and Arabella found herself alone with Ashford in the drawing-room. The servants had withdrawn, leaving them in a silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. "You did well tonight," Ashford said, standing by the mantelpiece, his profile severe in the firelight. "Thank you," Arabella replied. "Everyone was very kind." "Gray was overly familiar," Ashford said abruptly. "You should not encourage his attentions." "I did not encourage anything," Arabella said, surprised by the criticism. "He was merely being friendly." He was being grey, Ashford said, a note of frustration entering his voice. He does not understand boundaries. I will speak with him. That is not necessary, Arabella protested. Truly, I found his conversation refreshing. Is it so wrong to wish for friendship? Ashford turned to face her fully, and in his grey eyes she saw something she had not seen before. Confusion, perhaps even vulnerability. I do not know how to give you what you want, he said quietly. I can provide security, position, and every material comfort. But friendship, companionship, the things I suspect you truly desire, those are beyond my capability. The honest admission struck her more deeply than any romantic declaration could have. Here was the truth of him, a man so rigidly controlled, so thoroughly armored against emotion, that he literally did not know how to offer simple human connection. Why did you truly marry me? Arabella asked impulsively. The truth, not the practical reasons. Why me specifically? He was silent for a long moment, and she thought he would not answer. Then, surprising her, he spoke. Because when you refused Lord Pemberton, when you stood on that terrace and chose disgrace over compromise, I saw courage. And I thought a woman with that kind of courage might survive being married to me. The vulnerability in his voice, quickly suppressed but unmistakable, touched something deep within her. She moved closer to him, drawn by an impulse she did not fully understand. I am here, she said softly, and I am trying. But you must allow me to be more than just the Duchess. I need purpose, connection, something beyond household management and waiting to provide an heir. What do you want? He asked. I do not yet know, she admitted, but perhaps, if you would permit it, I might find out. Lady Sutton mentioned charity work in the village. Mr. Grey spoke of his excavations. There must be ways I can contribute, can matter beyond my biological function. She saw him flinch at the last phrase and realized her words had struck home. I have made you feel as though you are only valuable for that purpose, he said slowly. That was not my intent, though I see now it was the result. You are right. You should pursue your own interests. Whatever you wish to do, whatever you need, you have only to ask. It was a concession, small perhaps, but significant from a man who clearly did not make concessions easily. Arabella felt a strange warmth spreading through her chest. Not love, certainly not yet, but the first tentative recognition that perhaps this cold marriage might contain the seeds of something more substantial. Thank you, she said. That means more than you might realize. He nodded, then seemed to steel himself. There is another matter we must discuss. We have been married nearly a fortnight. I have given you time to adjust. But he did not finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. The time had come for the physical consummation of their marriage, the fulfillment of the primary purpose for which he had married her. Arabella's heart began to race, fear and something else, anticipation perhaps, warring within her. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment when her deception would potentially be revealed. If she could not conceive, if the damage was as severe as the physician had suggested, then everything, this house, this position, this tentative connection forming between them, would crumble to ash. I understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not tonight, he said, seeing her anxiety, but soon. You will need to prepare yourself. After he departed to his own chambers, Arabella stood alone in the drawing room, her hands pressed against her racing heart. The secret she carried felt like a physical weight, crushing the breath from her lungs. She should tell him. Honesty demanded it, but fear kept her silent. What if there was a chance, however small? What if the physician had been overly pessimistic? She was young, healthy despite the illness that had scarred her. Perhaps, with time and fortune, she could give him the heir he required. Or perhaps she was simply delaying the inevitable, prolonging the moment when he would discover her deception and cast her aside after all. Either way, she thought as she climbed the stairs to her lonely bed, the reckoning was approaching with the inexorability of dawn. 6 months had passed since Arabella became the Duchess of Ashford, and the passage of time had woven unexpected patterns into the fabric of her new life. The summer had mellowed into autumn, painting the Wiltshire countryside in shades of amber and gold. The great house, which had seemed so cold and imposing upon her arrival, had gradually transformed into something that felt, if not quite like home, then at least like a place where she belonged. The secret that had weighed so heavily upon her heart had, in a manner of speaking, resolved itself. The physical consummation of her marriage had occurred 3 weeks after the dinner party, in Ashford's bedchamber on a night when rain drummed against the windows and thunder rolled across the hills. He had been exactly as he promised, considerate in his way, though clinical in his approach. The act itself had been neither painful nor pleasant, simply a necessary transaction completed with minimal fuss. Afterward, he had thanked her with the same tone one might use to thank a servant for completing a task, and she had returned to her own chambers feeling strangely empty. In the months that followed, he came to her room perhaps once a week, always after dinner, always with the same courteous knock and the same careful attention to her physical comfort, if not her emotional state. And gradually, something unexpected had begun to happen. The careful distance between them had started to erode, worn away by daily proximity and small, incremental moments of genuine connection. It began with conversations at dinner, which evolved from strained silence to tentative exchanges about the estate, the tenants, the day's events. Ashford, she discovered, possessed a dry wit that emerged when he relaxed his guard. He was extraordinarily well-read, with strong opinions on everything from agricultural reform to the poetry of William Wordsworth. When she challenged his views, as she increasingly dared to do, his eyes would light with something that might have been pleasure at finding an intellectual equal. She had also pursued the interests he had granted her permission to explore. Under Lady Sutton's guidance, she had established a small school for tenant children in the village, teaching letters and arithmetic 3 mornings a week. The joy she found in watching young minds grasp new concepts, in seeing children who might otherwise have remained illiterate learn to read, filled something in her she had not known was empty. Mr. Gray had made good on his promise to show her the Roman villa excavation, and she had become fascinated by the fragments of ancient life emerging from the Wiltshire soil. She spent afternoons helping catalogue pottery shards and mosaic tiles, listening to Gray's enthusiastic theories about the villa's original inhabitants. Ashford had initially disapproved of her frequent visits to Gray's property, but when she explained the historical significance of the work and her genuine interest in it, he had reluctantly accepted it, though he still occasionally made terse comments about Gray's informality. But beneath all these developments, beneath the growing ease between her and Ashford, the question of an heir remained unresolved. Month after month, her courses arrived with painful regularity, each occurrence a reminder of her potential failure. She had not yet told Ashford about the physician's warning, and with each passing month, the secret grew heavier. She lived in a state of anxious suspension, waiting for the moment when he would lose patience, or when her body's inability to conceive would force a confrontation. That confrontation came on a cold November morning when she was working in the estate office with Mr. Thornfield, reviewing accounts for the school. Ashford entered unexpectedly, his face drawn with an expression she could not quite read. Mr. Thornfield excused himself with practiced discretion, leaving them alone. "I have received a letter from my solicitor," Ashford said without preamble. "He has heard disturbing rumors, questions about the validity of our marriage, speculation about whether you might be barren." The word landed like a blow. Arabella felt the blood drain from her face. "Who would spread such rumors?" "That is immaterial," Ashford replied, though his jaw was tight with anger. "What matters is that they exist. The dukedom requires an heir, Arabella. We have been married 6 months without result. I need to know if there is something I should be aware of." The moment had arrived. She could no longer hide behind hope and probability. She had to tell him the truth, whatever the consequences. "There is something," she said quietly, her hands clasping together in her lap. "Before we married, I was very ill with fever. The physician who treated me said there was damage, scarring. He told me that conception would be difficult, perhaps impossible. I should have told you before the wedding, but I was desperate and I hoped he might be wrong." The silence that followed was absolute. Ashford stood rigid, his face pale, his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, which somehow made it worse than if he had shouted. "You deceived me," he said. "The entire basis of our arrangement was your ability to provide an heir. You knew this, and yet you said nothing." "I know," Arabella whispered. "I am sorry. I was afraid." "Afraid of what? Of poverty, of losing your position?" His voice rose slightly, the first crack in his composure she had witnessed. "Did it not occur to you that I deserved the truth, that I was entering a contract under false pretenses?" "It occurred to me," she said, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks, despite her efforts to contain them. "Every day it occurred to me. But I also thought there might be a chance that perhaps the physician was too pessimistic, that perhaps with time—" "Time is precisely what we do not have," Ashford interrupted. "I am the last of my line, Arabella. If I die without an heir, everything, this house, this estate, 500 years of history, passes to my cousin, a man who would sell off the land piecemeal and dismantle everything my family has built. That is what was at stake. That is what you risked with your silence." "Then set me aside," Arabella said, rising to face him, her own anger finally kindling. "Seek an annulment. Find another woman who can give you what you need. I will not fight you. I will accept whatever consequences are warranted. But do not stand there and accuse me of being heartless when you yourself made it abundantly clear that I was nothing more than a vessel for your heir. You never asked who I was, what I wanted, what fears I carried. You offered me a transaction, and I accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered. If that was wrong, then we are both culpable." Her outburst seemed to shock him. He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. The rigid anger softened into something more complex, hurt, perhaps, and confusion. "You are right," he said finally, his voice quiet again. "I treated you like a commodity rather than a person. I thought that was kinder, somehow, than pretending to emotions I did not feel. But I see now it was simply cowardice. It is easier to maintain distance than to risk genuine connection." He moved to the window, staring out at the autumn landscape. "When my mother died, my father, he could not bear the grief. He shut himself away in his study and effectively disappeared from my life. I was 15, suddenly responsible for learning to manage the estate, for supporting my sisters through their mourning, for becoming the Duke-in-waiting. I learned to suppress emotion because emotion was a luxury I could not afford. And that pattern, it became who I am." Arabella moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability in his admission. "Who you were," she said gently, "not who you must always be." He turned to face her, and for the first time since she had known him, his grey eyes held something warm, something almost tender. "These months with you," he said slowly, "have been unexpected. You challenged me, argued with me, refused to be merely decorative. I found myself looking forward to dinner conversations, to hearing about your school, to watching you come alive when you discussed Gray's excavations. And I realized that somewhere in the midst of our practical arrangement, I had developed feelings that were decidedly impractical. Hope, fragile and tentative, bloomed in Arabella's chest. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that if you cannot give me an heir, then we shall face that circumstance together," Ashford said. "I am saying that you have become more important to me than the preservation of bloodlines. I am saying, though I am wretched at such declarations, that I love you, Arabella. And if that means the dukedom passes to my wretched cousin after my death, then so be it. I would rather spend whatever years I have with you than with some other woman who can fulfill the contract, but not this." He gestured helplessly between them, unable to articulate what this was, but Arabella understood. It was the tentative connection, the growing affection, the partnership that had developed despite the cold origins of their marriage. "I love you too," she whispered, the words emerging with surprising ease. "I did not expect to. I thought I would spend my life in dutiful loneliness, but you surprise me constantly. Beneath all that formidable control, you are kind and thoughtful and so very lonely, and I want to be the one to remind you that warmth exists, that emotion is not weakness, that you deserve to be happy." He crossed the remaining distance between them and took her hands in his. "We will consult physicians in London. Perhaps there are treatments. But even if there are not, I will not set you aside. You are my wife, Arabella, not because of a contract, but because I choose you. Every day, I choose you." When he kissed her this time, it was nothing like the cold brush of lips at their wedding or the perfunctory attention of their marital encounters. It was deep and searching, flavored with tenderness and the first stirrings of genuine passion. And when he led her to her chambers in the middle of the day, scandalizing Mrs. Barlow, who encountered them on the stairs, and made love to her with a care and attention that had nothing to do with air production and everything to do with genuine desire, Arabella finally understood what marriage could be when built on something more than transaction. The following months brought changes both subtle and profound. Ashford began taking breakfast with her, started showing her the estate management in detail, sought her opinion on decisions that affected their tenants. They walked together in the mornings, rode across the grounds in the afternoons, and spent evenings reading aloud to one another in the library. They argued about politics and philosophy, laughed at Mr. Gray's absurd stories, and attended village events as a genuine partnership. They did consult physicians in London, and while the prognosis remained uncertain, there was hope. One specialist suggested treatments, another mentioned cases where women with similar injuries had eventually conceived. But even if conception never occurred, Ashford proved true to his word. He loved her, she loved him. They would build their life together regardless of whether that life included children. It was on a spring morning, nearly a year after their wedding, that Arabella realized her courses were late. She said nothing at first, afraid to hope, afraid to disappoint. But when another week passed, then too, she finally confided in Ashford. His face, usually so controlled, lit with joy and fear in equal measure. "It might be nothing," she cautioned. "My courses have never been entirely regular since the illness." "Or it might be everything," he replied, gathering her into his arms with a fierce protectiveness she had never felt from him before. When the physician confirmed the pregnancy 2 months later, they clung to each other and wept. The child might not survive to term, the physician warned. The pregnancy would be carefully monitored. But for now, against all probability, they had been granted the miracle they had ceased to demand of fate. The pregnancy was indeed difficult, marked by periods of bed rest and constant anxiety. But through it all, Ashford remained steadfast, his love proving stronger than his need for an heir. On a cold December morning, as snow fell softly outside the windows of Ashford Abbey, Arabella delivered a healthy son. They named him William, after Ashford's father, and when the Duke held his son for the first time, tears streaming openly down his face, Arabella saw the final walls around his heart crumble into dust. Life was not perfect. They still argued, still had moments of frustration and misunderstanding, but they faced these challenges together with honesty and affection, building something sturdy and true from the cold foundation of their practical arrangement. 2 years after their son's birth, Arabella stood in the garden at Ashford Abbey, watching her husband play with William on the lawn. The boy was sturdy and laughing, chasing butterflies with his father pretending to be unable to catch them. Gray had stopped by with some new finds from the excavation, and Lady Sutton was visiting to review plans for the school's expansion. In the village beyond the estate walls, children she had taught were learning trades, building futures. This life, born from desperation and deception, watered with tears and honesty, had bloomed into something she could never have imagined that terrible night at Lady Crestwood's ball. She had been auctioned, in a sense. Her freedom traded for security, her agency exchanged for position. But in the end, she had not been purchased. She had been chosen. And in that choosing, in the daily decision to build something real from practical foundations, she had found the freedom she never knew existed. True freedom, she had learned, was not the absence of obligation or commitment. It was the ability to choose your obligations, to transform duty into devotion, to bloom where you were planted, even when the soil seemed cold and hostile. She had been planted in Wiltshire, in a marriage without love, in a role she never sought. But she had put down roots, reached toward the light, and grown into someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely happier than the frightened girl who had stood on that terrace refusing a fate she could not accept. As Ashford looked up from his play and caught her watching, as his face transformed with the smile he saved only for her, Arabella knew with certainty that some of the best gardens grow from the most unlikely seeds. And some of the truest loves develop from the coldest beginnings, warmed into life by patience, honesty, and the radical choice to see each other fully, flaws and all, and to choose each other anyway, every single day. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me which part resonated most with you. I love hearing your thoughts and knowing that these stories of courage, transformation, and unexpected love have traveled across the world to reach you. Thank you for listening.